Cyler decided to spend the weekend in a secluded cabin in the forest to escape the chaotic pace of the city. The weather reports warned of heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures, but that wasn't enough to deter him. Since childhood, he had loved nature, and spending time in the forest, especially during winter, brought him a deep sense of peace. He left the city early in the morning. His silver-gray, old but sturdy off-road vehicle was packed to the brim. Thick wool blankets, a few books, a flashlight, an axe, bags full of food, and plenty of coffee. Sitting by the fire, drinking coffee, and reading in complete silence was an invaluable experience for him. Traces of the snowstorm were evident on the road. The trees lining the roadside were covered in a white blanket, making it feel like he was driving through a tunnel of snow. Though his tires occasionally sank into the snow, his powerful engine and experience allowed him to navigate without much trouble. His eyes drifted from the road to the sky now and then. The pale sunlight breaking through the snow clouds added a faint warmth to the freezing air. After hours of driving, he finally arrived at the cabin. He gazed at the pile of snow in front of the door. The last time he had been here was in the summer, and now everything was unrecognizable. Parking his car beside the cabin, he pulled a shovel from the trunk. Clearing the entrance was the first thing he needed to do before stepping inside. As he shoveled the snow away, his breath turned into a fine white mist in the cold air. When he finally opened the door, he was greeted by the familiar scent of old wood. The cabin was freezing, but Cyler was well prepared for this. He immediately walked to the fireplace, stacked the logs, and struck a match. As the flames slowly grew, warmth spread through the space. He removed his thick coat, curled up near the fire, and listened to the silence. The only sounds were the wind howling through the trees outside and the soft crackling of the fire. As hunger set in, he started unpacking his supplies. He wanted to prepare something simple yet satisfying. He took thick slices of bread from his bag and lightly toasted them in an old cast-iron pan. Alongside, he had a can of tuna, some cheese, and a few olives. Sitting inside his warm cabin while snow fell outside, eating this modest but fulfilling meal filled him with a deep sense of peace. Placing a cup of coffee near the fireplace, he leaned back in the wooden chair. Just then, a faint rustling sound from outside caught his attention. He turned to look out the window but saw nothing other than the swirling snowflakes. Assuming the night would be quiet and solitary, he slowly closed his eyes. However, he was mistaken. Because that night, he would soon realize that he was not alone in the forest. Cyler sat in silence by the fireplace, sipping his hot coffee, when he heard the rustling sound outside once again. At first, he thought it was just the wind or an animal wandering through the forest. But then came a soft, indistinct tapping noise that sent a chill down his spine. Someone was knocking on the cabin door. This was not something he was used to hear. He hesitated for a moment. Could there really be someone else in the forest? Perhaps a hunter or someone who had lost their way. But his instincts whispered to him that this was no ordinary visitor. Still, his curiosity kept him from acting too cautiously. He slowly grabbed the knife resting on the edge of the table and walked toward the door. Taking a deep breath, he pulled it open only to find someone far different from what he had expected. Standing before him was a woman unlike anything nature or humanity had ever known. Lovsy, her skin had an unnatural shade of blue, glowing faintly in the darkness. Her long, wavy black hair cascaded over her shoulders, moving like a delicate shadow caught in the icy wind. She wore a red leather corset and long gloves that only emphasized her otherworldly appearance. Her lips were deep crimson, and her eyes sharp and mesmerizing seemed to have stolen the light of the stars. For several seconds, Cyler simply stood frozen, staring at her. He had never seen anyone like her, not in this forest, not anywhere in his life. Lovsy's lips curled into a soft smile as she spoke. "Sorry for disturbing you, but I think I'm lost." Her voice was smooth, almost hypnotic, carrying a melody that made it hard to look away. "It's freezing outside, and I don't think I can walk much further. May I come in to warm up?" Cyler studied her carefully, his eyes scanning her attire. No ordinary traveler would be wandering through a winter forest dressed like this. Even her boots seemed impractical for such harsh conditions, and she had no bag or equipment with her. "What are you doing in this forest?" he asked, his voice laced with natural suspicion. Lovsy hesitated briefly, glancing away before quickly returning her gaze to his, trying to appear sincere. "Well, it's a bit of a complicated story. I was coming from the city, but my car got stuck in the snow. I started walking to find help, but everything got confusing, and I lost my way." Cyler's instincts told him something was off about her story. There were no roads deep in this part of the forest. Even reaching the nearest main road would take at least an hour of walking. And if her car had really gotten stuck, he would have heard the sound of an engine. Yet there had been nothing but silence outside. "Really?" Cyler muttered to himself. "Are all these absurd coincidences happening at once, or is this woman lying to me?" The warm glow of the fireplace cast a faint light through the open doorway, creating a contrast against Lovsy's unusual skin. She narrowed her eyes slightly, as if she could sense his silent questions. "Look," Lovsy continued, "if you're worried, I can just stay for a few minutes, warm up, and leave. I really don't want to freeze to death out here." Cyler's mind was racing. Letting her in could be a huge risk. But what if she truly needed help? After all, few people ever found their way to this place, and the cold outside was dangerously unforgiving. His instincts kept warning him, but at the same time, he felt drawn in by Lovsy's deep, captivating gaze. Finally, after a deep breath, he pulled the door open a little wider and stepped back. "All right," he said, his voice still wary but firm. "But if you try anything, you're out immediately." Lovsy's soft smile returned. "I promise," she said in a gentle voice. As Cyler watched her step inside, he had the unmistakable feeling that this night was about to become far more complicated and far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. Before fully closing the door, Cyler carefully observed Lovsy as she stepped inside. The woman was scanning her surroundings like a hunter, taking in every detail of the room. She slowly rubbed her hands together over her chest as if trying to warm them, but her eyes never stopped moving, examining the fireplace, the items on the table, the old rifle leaning against the wall near the door. Cyler noticed these glances but chose not to say anything for now. He simply made a mental note of her every movement. "Thank you," Lovsy said, walking toward the center of the room. "I was really starting to freeze out there," but Cyler remained cautious. When he looked at her face, he saw a hint of relief. But was it just from the warmth, or something else entirely? As Lovsy moved closer to the fireplace and stretched out her hands toward the flames, Cyler locked the door and continued to watch her in silence. Her outfit truly wasn't suited for this kind of weather, yet strangely, she didn't seem all that cold. Her blue-tinted skin stood out in contrast to the warm, orange glow of the fire. For a few moments, silence filled the cabin. Cyler kept replaying her story in his mind. She claimed to have walked through the forest to get here, yet there was hardly any snow on her boots. How is that even possible? He thought. Then Lovsy's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Are you alone here?" she asked, narrowing her eyes slightly. Cyler shrugged. "Yeah, so. There's no one else." The question unsettled him. It felt deliberate. "Why do you ask?" he responded, his voice sharp with suspicion. Lovsy smiled, but there was something calculated about it. I just thought. If you've been here for a while, maybe there were others around too." Cyler tilted his head slightly, studying her. And at that moment, he could have sworn he saw her eyes change color just for a fraction of a second. A deep red flicker passed through her pupils before vanishing. Was he just imagining things? Was it the firelight playing tricks on him? Lovsy took a step back and wandered toward the other corner of the room. She pretended to examine the cabin, but Cyler could tell she was watching him just as much as he was watching her. "So, what are you doing here all alone?" she asked. Cyler hesitated for a second. He didn't want to reveal too much, just needed some peace and quiet. "I see." Lovsy slowly stepped closer, her tone friendlier now, as if trying to win his trust. "You're not much of a city person, are you? I mean, I don't hate big cities, but I feel better out here. Cyler replied, still trying to figure out why she was so eager to talk. Interesting, Lovsy murmured. I think this place would be a great escape for someone interesting. At that moment, Cyler's instinct screamed, something is off. The way she was asking so many questions, the way she scanned the room so attentively, the way she measured every single step she took, it all made him uneasy. But the biggest red flag of all was that she had never once truly looked cold, despite the freezing weather outside. As all of this played out, Lovsy's gaze briefly flicked toward an old bag resting in the corner of the room. Is she looking for something? Cyler wondered. Her eyes skimmed across the papers on the table, subtle but noticeable. Cyler slowly placed his hand over the knife at his side, but before she could notice, Lovsy turned to face him again. I'd like to know more about you, she said, her voice softer this time. What you do here, what kind of life you live. I'm sure you have a lot of stories to tell. Cyler narrowed his eyes. He still didn't know exactly what she was after, but now he was certain of one thing. This was no coincidence. Lovsy had come here on purpose. And she was definitely looking for something. As Cyler realized that Lovsy's gaze was scanning every detail in the room, his unease grew. But almost as if she had sensed his suspicions, Lovsy suddenly changed her demeanor. She tilted her head slightly, locking eyes with him, and spoke in a soft voice. I'm sorry, I think I made you a little uneasy. It's just, I haven't been alone in a place like this for a long time. When you step away from the crowds, things start to feel a little strange. Her eyes fixed on Cyler's face as if she could see right through him. In the firelight, her skin almost shimmered, and Cyler had to force himself not to stare into her gaze for too long. It's fine, he said, his voice still firm but slightly softer now. But this isn't exactly a place people just stumble upon. That's why I'm still having a hard time believing you got lost. Lovsy let out a quiet sigh and sat down on the chair next to the fireplace. As she crossed her legs, a faint sadness settled on her face. I know, it sounds strange. But I swear, all I was thinking about was getting warm and feeling safe. Outside, it's really terrifying. Cyler continued to watch her closely, but Lovsy was treading carefully. She slowly placed her hand on her arm, her fingers lightly brushing against Cyler's forearm. But I think, I'm not as scared anymore, she said with a small smile. Cyler felt his muscles tense. Lovsy's touch felt different, maybe a little too warm. Or was that just his imagination? A voice inside him whispered, don't let this happen. Yet, at the same time, her presence was strangely soothing. Lovsy continued, you still haven't told me why you came here. Did you run away from the city, or do you actually enjoy being here? Cyler didn't break eye contact. I didn't run from anything. I just like being here. So this place makes you feel free, Lovsy murmured, her voice almost a whisper. Cyler found himself smiling slightly. You could say that. A brief silence followed. Lovsy slowly withdrew her fingers, but the way Cyler looked at her had changed. He was still cautious, but now there was curiosity mixed in, perhaps even a bit of ease. Lovsy let out a light-hearted laugh. Maybe tonight, we can get used to each other a little more. After all, we're both here, and it's freezing outside. Cyler tilted his head slightly. That nagging feeling of something being wrong still lingered in his mind. But Lovsy's approach was so natural, so effortless, that resisting her was becoming increasingly difficult. She slowly stood from the chair and walked over to the fur blanket by the fireplace. Wrapping it around herself, she settled in comfortably while keeping her gaze on Cyler. So, how do you plan to spend the night? Cyler tried to suppress his doubts, searching for the true meaning behind her question. But what he didn't know was that Lovsy's eyes were subtly watching for the perfect moment to send a hidden signal. Because somewhere, deep in the forest, someone else was watching. Lovsy was waiting. As the firelight flickered, casting trembling shadows across the room, Lovsy wrapped herself in the fur blanket and slowly moved closer to Cyler. Her eyes were locked onto his face as if she could read his every thought, every hesitation. Cyler tried to suppress the doubts gnawing at him, but Lovsy's presence lingered around his mind like a thick fog. Her voice grew softer with each sentence, her demeanor warmer and more inviting. Even though you're questioning me so much, you're still letting me sit here, Lovsy said with a faint smile. Does that mean, deep down, you trust me? Cyler tilted his head slightly, furrowing his brows, but resisting Lovsy's smile was nearly impossible. I don't know what to think, he admitted honestly. Lovsy nodded slowly. Tell me. Do you remember the last time you truly trusted someone? The question caught Cyler off guard. Somewhere deep inside, buried memories surfaced, moments of trust that had led to disappointment. As his mind drifted through old wounds, Lovsy's fingers brushed lightly against his arm. Everyone has something they're running from, Lovsy whispered, her voice barely audible. Do you? Cyler swallowed. He couldn't explain it, but the way she spoke so closely, the way she looked at him, the way she moved, it all felt like some kind of spell wrapping around him. His carefully guarded instincts were slowly unraveling. Maybe, he muttered, lowering his gaze. Lovsy placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her eyes never leaving his. Then, why not stop running for just one night? Just be yourself. Cyler held his breath, his heartbeat quickened. Lovsy was drawing closer, her breath nearly brushing against his skin. She smelled faintly of something sweet yet intoxicating. His body felt like it was betraying him. If you're so unsure about trust. Lovsy's voice dropped even lower, her eyes narrowing slightly. The best way to test it is to let go, isn't it? Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, Lovsy's lips were nearly touching his. Her deep, dark eyes pierced into him, reaching beyond flesh straight into his very soul. And then, a sharp sting. Suddenly, a burning sensation flared on the side of Cyler's neck. His entire body tensed, frozen in place, his eyes widening in shock, but no sound escaped his lips. Lovsy murmured, her voice low and soothing. It won't take long. Cyler gasped for air, feeling his muscles go completely numb. His vision blurred, his mind sinking into a thick haze. The last thing he saw was Lovsy's crimson glove, a faintly red-stained inner lining. And hidden within, an almost invisible, needle-thin injector. And then, everything went black. As Cyler collapsed, the only sound remaining was the soft crackling of the fire. And soon, even that faded into silence. Lovsy tilted her head slightly as she carefully lowered his limp body onto the floor. There we go, she whispered, a sinister smile playing at her lips. Now, it's time to introduce you to my sister. Outside, in the darkness beyond the cabin door, a pair of silent eyes had been watching everything. Lissy stepped forward, her presence blending seamlessly with the cold night. And Cyler's fate was now entirely in their hands. As Cyler's consciousness sank into darkness, Lovsy leaned over him, carefully observing. His breathing was slow and deep, his body completely relaxed. The drug had worked perfectly, administered at just the right time and in just the right dose. Now, controlling him like a lifeless puppet was entirely in their hands. Footsteps echoed from outside the door, light, yet firm and deliberate. And then, the door slowly creaked open. The figure that stepped inside appeared almost ghostly in the dim glow of the fire. Lissy. She carried an aura even more distinct than Lovsy's. Long, curly golden hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her blue skin shimmered mysteriously under the flickering flames. But like Lovsy's dark, seductive gaze, Lissy's eyes were pure, icy blue, cold, calculating, and nearly devoid of emotion. While Lovsy's red leather corset and long gloves highlighted her untamed allure, Lissy's attire was entirely different. A skin-tight black corset, long leather gloves, and fitted boots. Similar to her sister, yet carrying a more gothic, ominous presence. For a few seconds, Lissy stood at the doorway, her gaze fixed on Cyler's unmoving body. Then, she turned to Lovsy and smirked. That was fast, she said, her voice cooler than Lovsy's. I thought it would take longer. Lovsy shrugged. Some give in easily, others resist. He questioned things a little, but the result is the same. Lissy stepped forward, crouching beside Cyler. She lifted his chin gently, studying his face. He was unconscious, but his breathing remained steady, his body still warm. Strong, Lissy murmured. That's good. He'll last longer. Then, her eyes shifted back to Lovsy. Are we keeping him here, or taking him where we planned? Lovsy smiled, locking eyes with her sister. We can't stay here too long. We need to move before anyone starts looking for him. Let's take him. A faint smile played on Lissy's lips. Perfect. Then let's begin. She knelt beside Cyler and pressed her fingers gently against the side of his neck, as if checking his pulse. But in reality, she was analyzing the muscle structure beneath his skin. His body is perfectly balanced, she whispered, satisfaction flickering across her expression. Just as we hoped. Lovsy tilted her head slightly in agreement. Yes, working on him will be interesting. Lissy's eyes gleamed in the firelight. Well then, it's time to take him. Cyler had no way out. As Cyler's unconscious body lay motionless, Lissy bit her lip slightly. So, how are we going to move him from here? She asked, turning to Lovsy. Lovsy stepped closer, lifting Cyler's arm and draping it over her shoulder. Easier than you think, she said with a sly smile. We might have to drag him instead of making him walk. But don't worry, he won't be escaping from us. Lissy raised an eyebrow, then pulled one of the blankets from the floor and spread it out. In that case, wrapping him in this will make carrying him easier, she suggested. Lovsy nodded in agreement. Together, they carefully placed Cyler onto the blanket. Lovsy glanced at his strong arms for a moment and whispered, "It'd be interesting to see how long he stays unconscious." Lissy secured thick leather straps around Cyler's wrists and ankles. Just in case, she added, if he wakes up, he might cause trouble. Once he was tightly wrapped in the blanket, the two sisters slowly but steadily dragged him out of the cabin. The air outside was freezing, the snow shimmered under the pale glow of the moon, and the only sound was the crunching of their footsteps against the icy ground. Lovsy and Lissy moved cautiously, carrying their heavy burden as thick fog wrapped around the forest, making everything even more eerie. As they walked deeper into the woods, Lovsy lifted her head and took a deep breath. I didn't think it would be this easy, she murmured, but this will be best for him. Lissy tightened her grip on Cyler's arm with her gloved hands. So, should we start discussing what kind of experiments we'll be running on him? Lovsy smiled slightly. Of course, after all, we have a long way to go. First, Lovsy began, we need to test his physical endurance. His muscle structure looks incredibly strong, but we can't be certain until we measure his nerve sensitivity. Lissy nodded. So, we'll apply mild electric currents to test his pain threshold. Lovsy smirked. Exactly, but that's just the first stage. What really interests me is how his body reacts to extreme temperature changes. I'm planning to expose him to both freezing cold and extreme heat. Lissy's eyes gleamed with excitement. We'll need to test for hypothermia. It'll be fascinating to see how the human body reacts to a drastic temperature drop. Exactly, Lovsy said, glancing at Cyler's unconscious face. And then, we'll test his mental endurance. Lissy raised an eyebrow. Are you planning to manipulate his subconscious? Lovsy nodded. By using mild serums, we can influence his stream of consciousness. If we keep him in a state between sleep and wakefulness, we can manipulate his dreams. Lissy grinned. If it works as we expect, he'll remember whatever we want him to remember. And start questioning what's real. Lovsy stared at Cyler's motionless body. Yes, she whispered. We're not just going to test him physically, we'll break him mentally too. As they advanced deeper into the forest, a nearly invisible metal hatch emerged from the ground. Hidden beneath the snow, it was barely noticeable. But when Lovsy crouched down and turned a concealed mechanism, the heavy cover groaned open. A cold, dimly lit concrete corridor stretched below them, a faint greenish glow seeping out from within. Without hesitation, Lissy and Lovsy dragged Cyler inside, carefully descending the stairs. As the metal door sealed shut behind them, Cyler's chance of escape dropped to absolute zero. The laboratory was illuminated by sterile white lights. Glass tubes, monitors, and metal tables were scattered throughout the space. Against one wall stood a large examination table, the exact place where Cyler would be restrained. Lovsy took a deep breath, adjusting her gloves. Let's begin, she said, her eyes roaming over Cyler's still body. Lissy gave a slow nod. a smirk forming on her lips. This is going to be fun. The sterile white lights of the laboratory cast a cold glow over Cyler's motionless body. He was tightly restrained on a metal table, secured with leather straps around his arms, legs, and chest, ensuring he couldn't move. Lovsy and Lissy circled him in silence, performing the final checks before the experiment began. "He's still unconscious," Lissy said, lightly touching Cyler's face. "But it won't be long now. The drug's effects should wear off soon." Lovsy smiled. "Perfect timing," she said. "It's better if he's awake for the experiments. That way, we can observe his reactions directly." Lissy picked up a metal tray beside her, carefully arranging the medical syringes inside. "First," she said calmly, "we'll test his nerve sensitivity. We'll start with small electric currents and see how he reacts." Lovsy nodded. "And then we'll test his heat tolerance. How does the human body respond to extreme temperature changes, especially someone as strong and resilient as him?" Lissy smirked. "Let's see if having such powerful muscles makes him more or less sensitive to pain." Cyler's eyelids flickered. His consciousness was slowly returning, but his head felt heavy, and his limbs weighed down as if made of lead. He tried to move, but the straps around his wrists and chest held him firmly in place. "What?" His voice was barely a whisper. As he turned his head slightly, Lovsy and Lissy's faces came into view. "Good morning, Cyler," Lovsy greeted him with a slight smile. "I hope you had a good sleep." At first, Cyler couldn't fully comprehend where he was. His memory was hazy. But within seconds, it hit him he was no longer in his cabin. This was somewhere else, cold, sterile, and dangerous. Where am I?" he groaned, struggling against his restraints. "You're in our laboratory," Lissy answered, her icy blue eyes glinting. "We're going to run a few tests on you, but don't worry, it won't be too painful." For now, Cyler's heartbeat quickened. He tugged at the straps, but the more he struggled, the more he realized how securely he was bound. "Why the hell did you bring me here?" he hissed, his voice growing sharper. Lovsy stared at him without blinking. "You're the perfect candidate for our experiments, Cyler. Your body is strong, your nervous system is resilient. And most importantly, you have nowhere to run." Lissy picked up a thin wire with a small electrode at the tip. She placed it against Cyler's bare shoulder and turned to Lovsy for confirmation. "We're starting," Lovsy announced. "First, we'll send a low-voltage electric current through your nerves to measure sensitivity. If you're as tough as we think, it should feel like nothing more than a mild tingling sensation." Cyler clenched his teeth. "Did you really think I'd let you do this?" Lovsy tilted her head slightly. "Let you?" she murmured. "Cyler, my dear. We've already started." At that moment, Lissy pressed the button. Cyler's muscles tensed instantly. A light shock rippled down his shoulder and through his arm, making his fingers twitch involuntarily. The sensation wasn't unbearable, but it sent a strange, unpleasant pulse through his nervous system. It lasted only a few seconds before stopping. Lissy jotted down notes. "Interesting," she said. "His muscle reflex is extremely quick, but his body immediately starts adapting. Should we try a stronger setting?" Lovsy shrugged. "Why not?" Cyler narrowed his eyes at them. "You can't use me as a test subject," he growled. Lissy leaned closer, tilting her head. "But we already are," she replied coldly, "and we're just getting started." After the first test, Lovsy and Lissy prepared for the next stage. Lovsy picked up a small ice cube from a metal tray. She pressed it firmly against Cyler's chest, and he inhaled sharply. The freezing sensation immediately seared his skin, the ice burning him in a way that was paradoxically painful. "This is just the beginning," Lovsy said, her voice soft but laced with hidden malice. "We want to observe how your body temperature reacts." Lissy then picked up a heated metal rod. It wasn't dangerously hot yet just warm enough to be uncomfortable. She gently pressed it near Cyler's wrist. Cyler clenched his teeth. "Why are you doing this?" Lovsy shook her head slowly. "Because we need to understand people like you," she said. "We need to see the limits of your strength. Who knows? Maybe you're the beginning of something much greater." Lissy smirked. "And we just Want to learn the truth? As Cyler continued to breathe heavily, Lovsy and Lissy began preparing for the next phase of their experiments. And Cyler knew one thing for certain: he had to find a way out. Cyler's body was stretched to its limits, every muscle fiber strained. His nerve endings felt like they were on fire, his breathing was erratic, and his heart pounded wildly in his chest. Lovsy and Lissy's cold, calculating gazes were locked onto him. Can he handle more? Lissy asked, inspecting the medical instruments laid out on the metal table. There's only one way to find out, Lovsy murmured, slowly lifting the syringe in her hand. Cyler wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He wanted to move, but the restraints held him tightly in place. His eyes grew heavy, the world blurred around him. And then, everything unraveled. He jolted upright, gasping for air. His entire body was drenched in sweat, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. He raised his trembling hands to his face, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. What had happened? He looked around. The fireplace was still burning, the logs crackling softly. The bed beneath him was still warm, and the air carried that familiar scent of old wood. It was just a dream, he whispered to himself. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath. Just a dream, but it had felt so real. The pain in his body still lingered as if he had actually been there. The cold metal table, Lovsy's sinister smile, Lissy's icy gaze. They weren't just fleeting images, they were imprinted in his mind like a vivid nightmare. Slowly, he shook his head, trying to shake off the lingering fear. But then, a soft knocking at the door. Cyler's blood turned to ice. His head slowly turned toward the entrance. The warmth inside the cabin vanished in an instant, replaced by a creeping chill. Someone was outside, his breath caught in his throat. Every muscle in his body tensed. Slowly, he placed his hands on the edge of the bed, ready to stand. And at that moment, a single thought whispered in his mind: was it really just a dream?